A first-class ticket. A woman who earned her place. And a humiliation so public, so calculated, that it demands revenge. Naomi Carter thought she was boarding a routine flight. She paid for her seat. She followed every rule. But none of that mattered, because someone decided she didn't belong. What started as a petty act of power quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous. Her name erased. Her reputation attacked. Her entire existence reduced to a fraudulent claim. But Naomi isn't just any passenger. She knows how the game is played, and she knows exactly how to burn it to the ground. By the time this plane lands, secrets will be exposed. Careers will be destroyed. And Naomi will prove, once and for all, that power isn't about where you sit. It's about who refuses to be moved. What would you do if this happened to you? Would you walk away? Or would you make them regret ever underestimating you? Tell me in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. If you love stories of power, revenge, and the kind of justice that hits where it hurts, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and buckle up, because this is just the beginning. Would you ever believe that a simple plane ticket could decide someone's fate? That a single, seemingly routine flight could reveal the hidden darkness of power, prejudice, and revenge? Naomi Carter had no idea that stepping onto Sky Atlantic 719 would not just be about traveling from New York to Los Angeles. It would become a battlefield where justice would either prevail or be buried beneath corruption. Naomi Carter, a poised and confident black woman in her mid-30s, walked down the narrow aisle of the first-class cabin. She adjusted the strap of her designer bag, her sleek black suit accentuating her commanding presence. Years as a top corporate attorney had honed her instincts, making her hyper-aware of the subtle shifts in energy around her. She had felt it the moment she stepped into the cabin, the scrutinizing stares, the silent assumptions. It wasn't new to her. It never was. She reached seat 2A, a plush, spacious section near the window, and slid her carry-on into the overhead compartment. Just as she settled into the seat, a cold, clipped voice interrupted her thoughts. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass again?" Naomi turned, meeting the icy blue gaze of Victoria Hale, the lead flight attendant. Victoria's uniform was pressed to perfection, her blonde hair twisted into a severe bun. There was no warmth in her expression, only something Naomi recognized all too well. A test. A challenge. A belief that she didn't belong. Naomi inhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral as she retrieved the crisp ticket from her pocket. Victoria took it, her eyes flicking between the paper and Naomi's face as if waiting for a discrepancy to appear. This doesn't seem right," Victoria murmured just loud enough for the other first-class passengers to hear. A few heads turned. A man in 2B, Richard Graves, an older white businessman in an expensive navy suit, smirked as he swirled his glass of whiskey. "Ah, the usual mix-up, huh?" he mused, his voice dripping with amusement. Naomi's grip on the armrest tightened, but she refused to react emotionally. "I booked this ticket a month ago. It's valid. If there's an issue, I suggest you check your system again." Her voice was smooth, practiced, unshaken. Victoria's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Of course. But these mistakes happen, especially with last-minute upgrades. There it was. The assumption that she couldn't have booked this seat on her own accord. That someone like her must have been handed an opportunity rather than earned it. "It wasn't an upgrade," Naomi stated firmly. "It was paid for in full. Do you need to scan it again?" Victoria hesitated, her eyes darting toward her tablet. "One moment." She turned away, tapping on the screen. Naomi watched closely, noting the flicker of frustration on the woman's face. Something was off. After an agonizing pause, Victoria looked back up, her expression suddenly triumphant. "I'm afraid our system isn't registering this ticket." Silence fell over the first-class cabin. Naomi's stomach clenched. "That's impossible." Victoria tilted her head. "Our records show that this seat wasn't assigned to you. You may need to return to the gate and speak with the staff there." A mistake. Or something more deliberate. Naomi's mind raced. She had been sitting at the terminal, reading through case files. There was no way she, or anyone authorized, had canceled her ticket. A murmur of voices spread across the cabin. A woman in 1D, a well-dressed brunette, whispered something to her husband, both of them throwing glances Naomi's way. Richard Graves chuckled under his breath. Well, looks like there's been a misunderstanding. Victoria's smirk deepened. You'll need to leave the seat, ma'am. Naomi's pulse pounded, but she remained composed. I am not moving until we resolve this. I have my confirmation email right here. She pulled out her phone, tapping into her inbox, scrolling to the Sky Atlantic confirmation. She held it up for Victoria to see. Explain this. Victoria barely glanced at the screen. Unfortunately, our system overrides any external documentation. If the ticket isn't active, you cannot remain in this seat. A sinking feeling settled in Naomi's stomach. Something was very wrong. Then, Victoria's hand moved subtly to her radio transmitter. She pressed the button and spoke, her voice carrying just the right amount of authority. Security, we have a situation in first-class cabin. Several passengers gasped as Victoria took a step back, arms folded, her expression triumphant. Naomi exhaled slowly. She knew exactly what was happening now. This wasn't an accident. This was an attempt to humiliate her, to remove her. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Would they really drag her off the plane in front of everyone? Naomi Carter sat still, her fingers gripping the armrest of seat 2A, her heart pounding, not out of fear but anger. She had fought too hard in her life to let someone like Victoria Hale dictate her worth. A hush fell over the first-class cabin as the passengers watched with morbid curiosity. The wealthy, suited businessman in 2B, Richard Graves, swirled his whiskey and smirked. Tisk, tisk, he mused, shaking his head. You should have just accepted the mistake and moved on, miss. Naomi shot him a sharp glance, but before she could respond, Victoria Hale pressed her radio transmitter again, her voice laced with triumph. Security, expedite your arrival. Passenger in first class is refusing to comply. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Naomi noticed how Victoria's posture changed. Back straight, chin lifted slightly, enjoying the attention. She wanted a scene. She wanted Naomi to be humiliated. A young brunette flight attendant, Lauren, hesitated nearby before stepping closer, her voice quieter. Victoria, I just checked the VIP list. Ms. Carter's name is on it. Victoria didn't even turn to look at her. Irrelevant. The system says her ticket is void. She needs to leave. Naomi's nails pressed into her palm as she exhaled sharply. If my name is on the VIP list, then you know this is a mistake. Fix it. Victoria folded her arms. I don't make mistakes, Ms. Carter. I follow protocol. The first security officer entered the cabin. Officer Blake, tall and broad-shouldered, glanced between Naomi and Victoria, his expression neutral but cautious. What seems to be the issue, he asked. Victoria turned to him with feigned concern. This passenger's ticket was voided. She is refusing to comply with flight policies. That's not true, Naomi interrupted, holding up her phone. I have my confirmation email right here. My seat was assigned, paid in full. Something's wrong with your system. Officer Blake took the phone and scanned the screen, his brow furrowing. Her booking confirmation is legitimate. Richard Graves let out a low chuckle. Legitimate or not, isn't it funny how some people always think the rules don't apply to them? Naomi turned to face him fully now. Excuse me. Richard leaned in slightly, eyes gleaming with condescension. Look, sweetheart, I'm sure you're used to talking your way into places you don't belong. But first class isn't a courtroom. Either you leave, or they take you out. The audacity made Naomi's blood boil. She had dealt with this her entire career. Men like him, people like Victoria, who thought power gave them the right to dictate where she belonged. Victoria let out a theatrical sigh, tapping her pen against her palm. Officer, please escort her off the aircraft. We have other passengers to attend to. Blake hesitated, then glanced at his partner, Officer Jensen, who had just entered. Jensen was different. Older, sharper eyes. He studied Naomi for a long moment, then looked at Victoria. You called this in pretty fast.
Victoria Stephened.
Excuse me. Just seems odd. Didn't even run a secondary check before requesting security. His tone was mild, but his gaze was knowing. Asterisk, asterisk. Naomi saw it, the flicker of irritation in Victoria's eyes. This wasn't going exactly how she'd planned. Lauren stepped forward again, more confident this time. Ms. Carter's name is on the VIP list, and we haven't had issues like this before. Maybe we should check the system again. Victoria's fingers twitched against her clipboard. She wanted Naomi gone, but now the cracks were showing. She had pushed too hard, too fast. Before she could respond, a deep male voice cut through the tension. What's the hold-up here? A tall man in an impeccable navy suit entered the cabin, his expression unreadable. James Benson, Sky Atlantic's regional gate manager. Naomi didn't move, but she could feel something shift.
Victoria blanched.
James looked at her. Ms. Hale, I just received a report that a VIP passenger was being forcibly removed without due process. That's an issue. Victoria's lips parted slightly. I was following standard procedure. James's gaze flickered to Naomi, then to the security officers. And yet, we have a valid booking confirmation, correct? Blake nodded. Yes, sir. Her ticket is valid. Silence. Naomi saw Victoria's jaw clench. This was slipping from her grasp. Richard Graves sat back, watching it unfold, but his smirk was gone. James adjusted his jacket. Ms. Carter, you are welcome to stay in your seat. Naomi finally leaned back, her hands relaxing. Thank you, but this wasn't over. James turned to Victoria. We'll discuss this after the flight. Victoria went pale, but she forced a nod. Understood. As James stepped back, Richard Graves let out a low laugh. Well, that was fun. Naomi looked at him, unblinking. Careful, Mr. Graves. This is only getting started. The plane was silent as the last first-class passengers boarded. The flight attendants returned to their duties, but the air had changed. Naomi turned back to the window as the plane taxied down the runway. She had won this round, but she wasn't done. Not yet. The plane had leveled out at cruising altitude, but Naomi Carter knew the battle was far from over. She sat back in seat 2A, her body relaxed, but her mind racing. The way Victoria had called security so quickly, the smug way Richard Graves had spoken, it wasn't just a mistake. Someone had planned this. She had faced many adversaries in courtrooms, but this was something else. She needed proof. Naomi reached for her phone, scrolling through her emails. The confirmation of her first-class booking was still there, time-stamped a month ago. Then she checked her airline app. Her ticket had been canceled exactly 30 minutes before boarding. 30 minutes ago. She had been sitting in the VIP lounge. She hadn't touched her phone except to review legal briefs. Someone had accessed her booking. Her mind sharpened. Who had the ability to do that? A movement caught her eye. Across the aisle, Richard Graves was texting someone. His lips curved in amusement. Naomi took a calculated breath. She opened a separate tab and quickly searched Sky Atlantic's internal booking system policies. Only 2 groups could cancel a first-class booking. 1. The passenger. 2. An authorized airline employee. She had done nothing. That meant it was someone on this plane. The realization sent a chill down her spine. A shadow fell over Naomi's seat. She glanced up to see Lauren, the young flight attendant who had tried to help earlier. Lauren hesitated, glancing around before speaking in a hushed tone. Ms. Carter, I don't think this was a system error. Naomi's eyes narrowed. You know something. Lauren shifted uncomfortably. I overheard Victoria talking to someone before the flight. She was laughing about fixing something in the system. And then she said your seat won't be an issue anymore. Naomi's stomach clenched. Who was she talking to? Lauren hesitated, glancing toward the first-class galley. I couldn't see, but she took a call right before boarding. When I walked past, I saw the name R. Graves on her screen. Naomi's pulse spiked.
Richard Graves.
He had planned this. She turned her head slightly, watching him sip his whiskey. He knew she was onto him. Naomi let out a slow breath. Fine. If they wanted to play games, she would play too. She looked back at Lauren. Can you get me access to the flight's Wi-Fi? Lauren nodded and handed her a small slip of paper with a crew access code scribbled on it. Naomi quickly connected and opened her secure legal portal. She typed in a few credentials and pulled up the Sky Atlantic employee directory. She found Victoria Hale's employee profile and nearly smirked. She had only been promoted to lead flight attendant 3 months ago, and her promotion had been personally recommended by
Richard Graves.
Bingo! Naomi tapped her fingers against the tray table, thinking fast. She sent a quick, coded email to one of her contacts in cybersecurity. Need a system trace. Sky Atlantic Flight 719. First class booking cancellation. See what you find. Then, she copied James Benson, the regional manager who had intervened earlier, and typed a separate message. James, I need you to verify something. Can you check which employee ID was used to cancel my booking? She hit send and waited. Minutes later, a reply came in from her cybersecurity contact. Urgent. Naomi, your ticket was canceled using an internal employee login. The user ID belongs to Victoria Hale. Naomi felt a slow, dangerous smile curl at her lips. She had her proof. Then, another email from James Benson. Ms. Carter, I checked. The system logs show your seat was manually deleted at 5:32 p.m., 30 minutes before departure. The request came from Victoria Hale's employee credentials. Naomi's fingers tightened around her phone. It was official. Victoria had abused her position to try and remove Naomi from the flight. And Richard Graves was behind it. She glanced at Graves again, her mind racing. Why would he go through so much effort to remove her? Then, as if sensing her thoughts, Graves turned to her and smirked. Enjoying the flight? Naomi's eyes burned into his. Oh, I am. But I imagine your trip won't be as comfortable soon. Graves chuckled. Is that a threat? Naomi took a slow sip of her water, then set it down with deliberate precision. Not at all. Just a legal guarantee. His smirk faltered. Just slightly. She had him. Naomi Carter had spent her entire career dismantling arrogant men who thought they were untouchable. Richard Graves was just another name on a long list of people who would regret underestimating her. She remained perfectly composed as she locked eyes with Graves. He thought he had won, but the tide had already turned. Something on your mind, Ms. Carter? He asked, voice smooth and confident. She smiled. Oh, nothing important. Just thinking about how quickly fortunes can change at 35,000 feet. His smirk barely faltered. That's so. She nodded, then tapped her phone screen. You should know. The request to cancel my booking? It was made from an employee login, Victoria Hale's credentials, to be exact. Richard took a slow sip of his whiskey, unfazed. I have no idea what you're talking about. You always this careless when you try to erase someone from a flight? He chuckled, shaking his head. You think you're clever, don't you? Naomi leaned in slightly.
No.
I know I am. Before he could respond, the intercom crackled, and a voice came through. Ms. Victoria Hale, please report to the front galley immediately. Victoria turned sharply, her face stiff. Graves exhaled through his nose, his fingers tightening around his glass. Naomi sat back, watching as Victoria rose from her seat and stormed toward the galley. This was it. A minute passed, then another. The tension in the first-class cabin thickened. Then, James Benson reappeared. His expression was blank, but his presence alone sent a wave of unease through the air. He walked straight to Naomi's seat. Ms. Carter, I apologize for the disturbance. May I have a word? Naomi stood, smoothing out her blazer. Of course. They stepped toward the galley, where Victoria stood stiffly, arms crossed. James took out a tablet, tapped the screen, then turned it toward her. "Victoria, the system logs confirm that you manually voided Ms. Carter's ticket. That is a severe violation of company policy." Victoria's face paled. That's a mistake." James didn't blink. "You'll be placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. I suggest you take your seat for the remainder of the flight. Security will escort you upon landing." Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. Her face burned red, and for the first time, Naomi saw the cracks in her confidence. "I was just..." "Sit down, Ms. Hale," James said, voice sharp. Victoria turned on her heel and walked back to her seat, her movements stiff. The entire first-class cabin watched as she sank into the economy section, her demotion clear to everyone on board. Naomi turned back to James. "And Graves?" James's expression darkened. "That will take longer, but we're working on it." Naomi nodded, then returned to her seat. Graves watched her closely, but now there was no amusement in his eyes. Only calculation. "You think this is over?" he muttered. She smiled. "Oh no, Mr. Graves. I think it's just beginning." The flight continued in tense silence. Naomi Carter felt the weight of Richard Graves' gaze on her, but she refused to let it shake her. She had rattled him, that much was clear. But she also knew men like him didn't back down easily. If anything, she had just made herself a target. The cabin had settled into uneasy silence. Victoria Hale was gone, humiliated, stripped of her authority, forced to sit in economy like a passenger she would have once sneered at. But Richard Graves? He was still here, and she knew he wasn't finished. A flight attendant passed by, offering drinks. Graves took another whiskey, swirling it lazily in his glass. His confidence had taken a hit, but his arrogance remained intact. "You know," he said smoothly, tilting his glass toward her, "you're quite the troublemaker." Naomi barely spared him a glance. "I've been called worse." He smirked. "Oh, I have no doubt." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "But tell me, Naomi, do you really think this ends with a flight suspension?" Naomi finally looked at him. "I think you should enjoy your drink while you still can." His smirk widened. "You really don't get it, do you?" He took a slow sip, savoring the moment. "This isn't about a seat. It never was." Naomi stayed silent. She wanted to hear what he had to say. "You're a problem," he continued, his voice low but sharp. "The kind that needs to be handled." Her fingers curled slightly, but she forced herself to remain composed. "People like you," Graves continued, gesturing vaguely, "always think that just because you've made it to the table, you belong there. But see, that's the thing about power. It isn't given. It's taken." Naomi held his gaze. "And you think you have the power here?"
Graves chuckled.
"I think you're very much alone right now." At that moment, a flight attendant approached, holding a phone. "Mr. Graves, there's a call for you." He raised an eyebrow but took the phone.
Graves.
Naomi watched as his expression remained neutral at first. Then, just barely, she saw it, a flicker of something. Annoyance. "Understood," he finally said before handing the phone back. Naomi sipped her water, waiting. "Bad news." Graves exhaled, tapping his fingers against the armrest. "Nothing that concerns you." She knew that was a lie. Someone had just told him something he didn't like. And that meant she had just become more of a problem than he anticipated. Graves glanced at his watch, then at Naomi. "Enjoy the rest of the flight," he murmured before standing and walking toward the galley. She didn't turn to watch him leave. Instead, she stared out the window, feeling the quiet storm brewing in the air. She wasn't sure what Richard Graves was planning. But she knew one thing. It wasn't over. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted. The turbulence wasn't just in the air. It was in the silence, in the stolen glances, in the invisible but undeniable weight pressing down on Naomi Carter. She knew Richard Graves was planning something. He had walked away with too much confidence, his smug composure barely dented despite Victoria Hale's downfall. That meant he had another card to play, and Naomi wouldn't have to wait long to see what it was. A flight attendant appeared near her seat, holding a tablet. Her name tag read Rebecca, and Naomi could already see the hesitation in her expression. "Ms. Carter," Rebecca said carefully, "I'm sorry to disturb you, but there seems to be another issue with your ticket." Naomi exhaled slowly, keeping her face unreadable. "Another issue?" Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. "Your payment for this seat. It appears to have been flagged for fraud." The words hit like a slap. There it was. Naomi kept her voice level. "That's impossible. I booked this ticket through my firm's corporate account." Rebecca swallowed. "Yes, ma'am, but we received an alert just now stating that the payment method used is under investigation for fraudulent activity. The airline has been notified, and we're required to take action immediately." Naomi's pulse remained steady, but inside, she was seething. This was Graves. She didn't know how, but somehow, he had pulled the right strings to make this happen. She looked past Rebecca. Graves had returned to his seat, watching the scene unfold with quiet amusement. He raised his whiskey glass slightly, as if toasting her demise. Naomi turned back to Rebecca. "And what action are you required to take?" Rebecca hesitated. We need to ask you to step out of first class while this is sorted out." A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the cabin. That was the real play. Not just to inconvenience her, to humiliate her. Publicly. Again. She could see it already. The whispers, the assumptions, the lingering glances from passengers who had been watching from the beginning, waiting for the inevitable confirmation that she didn't belong here. Naomi inhaled slowly, controlling her fury. "I see." Rebecca's face pinched slightly, as if she knew how wrong this was but had no choice in the matter. "I'm so sorry, ma'am." Naomi glanced at the flight attendant's tablet. "Can you show me the exact notice?" Rebecca hesitated, then subtly tilted the screen. "Payment flagged for fraudulent activity. Investigate immediately. Do not allow continued access to first-class cabin." No actual source. No verified fraud alert. Just a vague directive. It wasn't real. Naomi knew exactly what had happened. Graves had used his influence, his power within the airline, his network of corporate puppets, to manufacture a problem that didn't exist. And now, he was sitting back, watching her reaction. She had two choices. 1. Refuse to move, cause a scene, and give him exactly what he wanted. A public display of unruly behavior that would make her look unhinged. 2. Step out of first class and take the humiliation, knowing that the real battle was still ahead. Naomi turned her head slightly, meeting Graves' gaze. He gave her a slow, taunting smirk. Checkmate, or so he thought. She straightened her blazer, then stood up with calculated grace. The murmurs grew louder. She ignored them. She looked at Rebecca and nodded. "Lead the way." Rebecca blinked in surprise, but quickly stepped aside. Naomi picked up her bag, adjusted her posture, and walked down the aisle, past the judging eyes, past the quiet whispers, past Graves' victorious smirk. But she wasn't defeated. She wasn't done. Not yet. She had learned long ago that sometimes, you let the villain think they've won before you destroy them completely. She disappeared into the economy cabin, leaving first class behind. For now. The transition from first class to economy felt like a walk of shame, but Naomi Carter kept her head high. She refused to let Graves see her break. He wanted her to feel powerless, humiliated, like she was being stripped of something she didn't deserve. But he had underestimated her. She took her new seat near the back of the plane, ignoring the way a few passengers glanced at her before quickly looking away. She exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the setup against her. Graves was pushing harder. That meant he was afraid. The moment she settled in, her phone vibrated. A single email. Subject: immediate action required. Naomi's stomach twisted as she opened it. "Ms. Carter, it has come to our attention that your presence on this flight is now under internal review. There have been multiple reports regarding fraudulent activity linked to your booking. Given the severity of the claims, the airline must take necessary precautions. Upon landing, security personnel will be escorting you for questioning." Her pulse remained steady, but inside, She was raging. He was setting her up for an even bigger fall. The flight wasn't even over, and Graves had already escalated from humiliating her to framing her as a criminal. She tightened her grip on her phone. Fraudulent activity? Multiple reports? Who the hell was reporting her? As if to answer the question, a familiar chuckle reached her ears. Naomi didn't have to turn around. She knew who it was. "Wow," Richard Graves mused just loud enough for her to hear. "They really don't play around with fraud these days, huh?" Naomi finally looked at him. He had left his first-class seat and was now standing just a few feet away, pretending to stretch, his expression casual, amused. "You seem entertained," she said, voice smooth as glass. He gave a mock frown. No, just concerned. I mean, this is serious, Naomi. What's going to happen when we land? You think they'll just let you go?" She tilted her head. "I wouldn't worry about me, Mr. Graves. You should be asking yourself what happens when they find out the truth." He grinned. "The truth. The truth is whatever people believe. And right now, people believe you're a fraud." He leaned in slightly. "See, you made a mistake, Naomi. You embarrassed the wrong people. You should have just taken the hint back in first class." Naomi didn't flinch. He was overplaying his hand. "So what now?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "I get off the plane in cuffs?" He shrugged. "Wouldn't that be a shame? A high-powered attorney, dragged off like a common criminal? Hell of a headline." Naomi let him have his moment. She wanted him comfortable, overconfident. She simply smiled. "Well, let's see if that headline holds up after the real story comes out."
Graves. Smirk flicked.
That was all she needed. Naomi turned away from him, taking out her phone. She wasn't going to fight him here, not yet. But she had just confirmed something important. Graves wasn't just enjoying her downfall. He was orchestrating it. And that meant he had left a trail. She quickly typed out a message to James Benson.
James, urgent.
"Someone inside the airline is feeding false reports against me. I need a full log of every complaint filed under my name within the last hour." She sent it. Then another vibration followed. A new email. She opened it, heart pounding. "Naomi, it's worse than we thought. I pulled up the security logs. Someone used a manager-level access code to input the fraud claim against your ticket. It's official. You've been blacklisted from Sky Atlantic Airlines." Her breath caught. Blacklisted. She wasn't just being thrown off this flight. If this stuck, she wouldn't be able to fly with any major airline ever again. Graves wasn't just trying to ruin her trip. He was trying to destroy her career. She forced herself to stay calm, even as the walls of the trap closed in around her. The plane was still in the air. She still had time. But the moment they landed, the real fight would begin. Naomi Carter sat motionless, her mind racing even as her body remained composed. The trap had been set against her, and for the past few hours, she had been forced into the role of a silent victim. Blacklisted, accused of fraud, removed from first class, set up to be disgraced upon landing. Richard Graves had built the perfect case against her. But there was one fatal flaw in his plan. He had underestimated who he was dealing with. Her phone vibrated again. Another email. "Naomi, I found something. That fraud alert." It was triggered using a temporary access code assigned to a senior executive. And guess who authorized it?
Richard Graves.
Naomi took in a slow, measured breath. There it was. The proof she needed. Graves had been careful, but not careful enough. His influence inside the airline had allowed him to manipulate the system, but he had left a digital footprint. And digital footprints? Those were the kind of things Naomi knew how to use as weapons. She exhaled, steadying herself. Not yet. Not here. She needed Graves to believe he had won, until it was too late for him to escape. She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch his smug expression from across the aisle. He was watching her, the way a predator watches prey that has stopped struggling. He thought she was broken. She slowly turned to face him. Richard. He raised an eyebrow, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Yes. Naomi smiled, calm, knowing, the kind of smile that should have made him nervous but didn't. Not yet. You should order another drink. He tilted his head slightly. Oh. Celebrating something. She shrugged. Might be the last good whiskey you have for a while. His smirk wavered, just for a fraction of a second. You're not as untouchable as you think you are, Naomi. Her smile never wavered. Neither are you. Graves let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? By the time this flight lands, your name will be trash. Your reputation, gone. You're finished. Naomi exhaled, stretching her arms in an exaggerated motion. That's interesting, because the thing about men like you, Richard, you always overplay your hand. His expression sharpened. What the hell does that mean? She glanced at her phone again. The next message had arrived. We traced the entire setup. Audio logs confirm Graves was involved in coordinating the fraud alert. IT has flagged his access history. Security is waiting at LAX. Naomi leaned back in her seat, her victory already in motion. You made one mistake, Richard, she said, her voice low, controlled. His smirk was gone now. And what's that? She met his gaze, unblinking. You thought I wouldn't see you coming. For the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. And Naomi knew, he realized it too late. The power had shifted. The moment they landed, Graves wouldn't be the one watching her get dragged off the plane. He would be the one in handcuffs. As the final hours of the flight passed, Naomi kept her composure. She didn't rush. She let Graves enjoy his false sense of security. She checked her emails one last time. James Benson, the airline manager who had intervened earlier, had forwarded her the official security report. The fraud alert was falsified. The system showed Richard Graves' executive clearance used to input the blacklisting order. Audio logs confirmed Graves had coordinated with Victoria Hale before the flight. Naomi could almost hear the judge's gavel slamming down. Graves had signed his own sentence. She adjusted her blazer, rolling her shoulders. Time to play her final move. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent into Los Angeles shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. Naomi barely noticed the announcement. Richard Graves sat across from her, oblivious to what was waiting for him. He still believed he had won. Naomi looked out the window, watching as the city lights of Los Angeles came into view. She knew what would happen the moment they touched down. The moment the fasten seatbelt sign went off, security would enter the aircraft. They wouldn't be coming for her. They'd be coming for Richard Graves. And Naomi? She would be walking off this plane exactly as she was meant to, with her head held high, undefeated. The final descent into Los Angeles had begun, but Naomi Carter wasn't focused on the view outside the window. She was waiting for the moment Richard Graves realized his downfall was inevitable. The seatbelt sign flickered on, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the cabin. Passengers stretched, adjusted their belongings, completely unaware that one of them was about to be ruined. Naomi checked her phone one last time. Security is on standby at LAX. We'll be boarding immediately upon landing. Her fingers tightened around the device before she slowly set it down on her lap. It was time. She turned her head slightly, catching sight of Graves. He was relaxed, too relaxed, fingers lazily tapping against the armrest of his seat. He still thought he had won. She wasn't going to let him figure out the truth until it was too late. Graves turned to her, smirking. You seem tense, Naomi. She tilted her head slightly. Do I? He chuckled, swirling the last remnants of whiskey in his glass. I guess it makes sense. You're probably wondering how bad it's going to be when you land. Security, media, your name getting dragged through the mud. He let out a slow, satisfied sigh. You had your moment of defiance. I'll give you that. But let's be honest. This was inevitable. Naomi let out a breath, calm and measured. She had played this game before. Graves just didn't realize he was the one who had already lost. "You always talk this much when you're nervous, Richard?" she asked. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained himself. "I have nothing to be nervous about." Naomi held his gaze. "Then why are your hands shaking?" Graves glanced down, his fingers tightening around the glass. "Cute," he muttered. The intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Flight crew, prepare for landing." The plane dipped lower, the city lights growing sharper beneath them. Naomi took in a slow breath, steadying herself. She was about to win, and she was going to make sure Graves knew it. As the plane's wheels touched the runway, Naomi could feel the shift. The quiet, controlled atmosphere of the cabin had changed into one of impatience and anticipation. People began unbuckling their seatbelts, stretching, murmuring about their plans once they got off the plane. But Naomi wasn't thinking about what happened after the flight. She was thinking about what would happen before anyone even left their seats. The moment the fastened seatbelt sign turned off, Naomi reached down, picked up her phone, and pressed play. A voice rang through the cabin. Richard Graves' voice. "Just get her off the damn flight. I don't care how you do it. Flag her ticket, blacklist her, whatever it takes. She doesn't belong here." The cabin fell silent. Every single passenger turned their heads.
Richard Graves froze.
Naomi sat back, her expression unreadable as the recording continued to play. His conversations with Victoria Hale, his orders to fabricate a fraud claim, the smug way he had planned to ruin her reputation for no reason other than his own arrogance. The whispers started immediately. Someone gasped. A woman from first class muttered, "Oh my God, he really did it." Graves' face turned pale, his lips parting as if searching for a way to explain. "Where did you get that?" he hissed. Naomi smiled, tucking her phone into her blazer. "You really should be more careful about who you threaten, Richard. Some of us know how to fight back." Graves' breathing turned shallow. Passengers were staring at him now, whispering, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. He wasn't the powerful, untouchable figure he had pretended to be anymore. He was exposed. A flight attendant rushed toward them, eyes wide. "What's going on?" Naomi didn't have to answer, because right at that moment, security boarded the plane. Two uniformed officers entered the first-class cabin, scanning the passengers before their eyes locked onto Graves. The entire plane watched. Richard Graves had spent hours orchestrating Naomi's downfall, but now he was the one being removed. "Mr. Graves," one of the officers said, voice firm, "you need to come with us."
Graves snapped.
"You can't be serious," he barked. "This is insane. Do you know who I am?" The officers didn't waver. "Sir, we strongly suggest you don't make this difficult." Graves turned to Naomi, fury burning in his eyes. "You think this changes anything?" Naomi didn't flinch. She simply lifted her chin. "Yes, Richard," she said. "Ido." The officers grabbed him by the arms. Graves shouted, struggling, but it was over. Passengers started whispering again, this time not about Naomi, but about him. About the disgraced businessman being dragged off the flight in humiliation. Naomi sat back in her seat, watching as Graves was escorted away, his once smug expression replaced with pure, unfiltered rage. And just like that, the man who had tried to destroy her was erased in front of everyone. The cabin took a long time to return to normal. Naomi stayed in her seat as people turned to look at her differently now. Some with admiration, some with quiet apologies in their eyes. A flight attendant approached, clearing her throat awkwardly. "Ms. Carter," she said, voice careful, "if you'd like, we can arrange for you to return to first class now that, well..." She trailed off, but Naomi knew what she meant. Now that the real fraud had been removed. Naomi gave a small smile, shaking her head. "Thank you, but I think I'm fine right here." She wasn't moving, because she had already won. Los Angeles was glowing beneath the night sky as Naomi Carter stepped off the plane, the cool airport air brushing against her skin. She had won. The weight that had sat on her shoulders since she first boarded was gone, replaced with a calm certainty. Justice had been served. Behind her, Richard Graves was being led away by security, his once polished composure shattered. His shouts of protest echoed through the terminal. "You people don't understand. This is a mistake. I have connections. This won't stand." Naomi paused for just a second. She turned slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. Graves wasn't smirking now. His face was red, his breath coming in sharp, furious bursts. "You think this is over, Carter?" he spat. "You think you won?" Naomi met his gaze, completely unfazed. "Oh, Richard," she said smoothly. "I don't think I won. I know I did." Before he could respond, security pushed him forward, his protests drowned out by the clicking of cameras. The media had arrived, drawn by the whispers of a high-profile executive being detained straight off a flight. And Naomi? She simply walked past them, head high, like none of it concerned her at all. By the time she reached the car waiting for her outside the airport, her phone was already buzzing with news alerts. Breaking. Sky Atlantic executive Richard Graves accused of fraudulent tampering with passenger records. Leaked recording exposes airline corruption scandal. Attorney Naomi Carter at the center of the story. She smirked as she slid into the back seat, crossing her legs as she scanned the headlines. The world was already tearing him apart. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Ms. Carter, straight to your hotel?" She thought about it for a second, then shook her head.
No.
"Take me to the Sky Atlantic Regional Office." The driver didn't question it. "Yes, ma'am." 30 minutes later, Naomi was sitting in the executive conference room at Sky Atlantic's Los Angeles headquarters. Across from her sat James Benson, the same gate manager who had first intervened on the plane. He looked more composed now, but there was something else in his eyes: respect. "You didn't have to come here tonight," he said, watching her carefully. Naomi leaned back in her chair. "Oh, but I did." She slid a file across the table. James hesitated, then opened it. His eyes flickered as he took in the documents. Complaints, reports, internal communications. "This isn't just about me, James," Naomi said. "This is about how men like Richard Graves have been abusing their power inside your airline for years. I assume you don't want that to continue." James exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "We're already moving forward with an internal review." Naomi raised an eyebrow. An internal review won't be enough. People like him don't just get removed, they get replaced by someone just as corrupt. James looked at her, considering her words. "What are you proposing?" She smiled. "Simple. You don't just fire Graves. You clean house. Every executive connected to him, every manager who turned a blind eye, you get rid of them all. And then, you make sure it never happens again." James studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You don't waste time, do you?" Naomi smirked. "I don't believe in half measures, James." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll take this to the board first thing in the morning." She stood, smoothing down her blazer. "No need. They'll have already seen it in the headlines." James gave a small, knowing smile. "I suppose they will." As Naomi turned to leave, James called after her. "Ms. Carter." She glanced back. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad you were on that flight." She nodded. "So am I." And with that, she walked out, leaving behind more than just a scandal. She had forced a reckoning. The next morning, the fallout was immediate and devastating. Richard Graves was officially terminated from Sky Atlantic, his name plastered across every major news outlet. The leaked recording spread like wildfire, and within hours, other victims came forward, sharing their own experiences of discrimination and abuse under his leadership. By noon, the Sky Atlantic board announced a full-scale overhaul of their corporate leadership. Victoria Hale, the flight attendant who had been Graves' pawn, she was permanently banned from working in the airline industry. And Naomi? She received a personal call from Sky Atlantic CEO, offering a formal apology and an invitation to work as an external consultant for their legal division. She turned them down, because this wasn't about career opportunities. This was about sending a message. That evening, Naomi sat in her hotel room, glass of wine in hand, watching the news coverage of Graves' downfall. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She considered ignoring it but decided otherwise. Naomi Carter. A deep breath on the other end. And, "You ruined me." Richard Graves' voice was hoarse, filled with barely contained rage. Naomi smiled. "No, Richard, you ruined yourself. I just made sure the world saw it." A long silence. Then, a bitter laugh. "This isn't over." Naomi swirled her wine, unbothered. "Oh, I think it is. But if you ever try anything like this again, trust me, what happened to you today will feel like mercy." She didn't wait for a response. She hung up. And with that, Naomi Carter finally allowed herself to relax. She had won. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And that was justice. The end. If this were you, how far would you have gone for justice? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who loves a good plot twist.